Up until now, our discussion of agriculture has painted a generally positive picture of the innovations and advancements that have brought about very significantly increases in productivity and food security for the world, including the innovations of the Green Revolution and the more recent advantages offered by GMO crops. At the same time, the picture is not all rosy, and we have also touched on some of the negative consequences that have come from the modernization of agriculture. This section and the next are ones dedicated to elaborating more on those negative consequences before transitioning into a discussion of alternative approaches and how we might do better. How this section will be structured is modeled after an earlier slide that you'll probably remember from the previous section, where we went over the five main advancements that came out of the Green Revolution: high yielding crop varieties, synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, irrigation techniques, and machinery and automation. You know what benefits each of these have created. Now we're going to talk through them one by one about their negative consequences, starting with high yielding crop varieties. When high yielding crop varieties were adopted, most farmers went all in, meaning that they turned to monoculture, the practice of cultivating a single crop variety rather than a diverse community of different crops. The prefix mono means one, so one crop. The high yielding crops were so much more productive and profitable that this made economic sense. But with the rise of monoculture as the dominant form of farming has come the loss of many traditional crop varieties that carry their own benefits. Did you know that there are hundreds of different varieties of bananas in the world? Probably not, because 99% of globally exported bananas today are just a single variety, the Cavendish banana. This is the case for so many food crops. But I mentioned the Cavendish banana in particular because since the 1990s, it has been threatened by an infectious fungus that causes a disease called banana wilt. The fungus appeared first in Taiwan, and it has now spread to 20 countries, and it continues to spread and threaten global banana supplies. This is the problem with monocropping. If you only raise one variety of a crop, then when something goes wrong with that variety, the potential losses are huge. By edging out other traditional crop varieties, you lose on desirable traits like drought, pest, or disease resistance that make a food supply more diverse and more robust. Next on our list of factors to examine is synthetic fertilizer use. We talked about this previously when we were looking at the nitrogen cycle. In many parts of the world, more and more synthetic fertilizer is being applied to cropland with diminishing returns on that investment. Because in many countries, a majority of that fertilizer is simply washing away, leaching into the groundwater, washing into streams and rivers, and ending up in oceans. When this happens, it triggers a phenomenon known as eutrophication, the process in which a body of water becomes overly enriched with excessive nutrients, namely nitrogen and phosphorus, which are the most common limiting nutrients. And as a result, an explosion in the growth of algae occurs. And although these algae are photoautotrophs, remember that photoautotrophs also perform cellular respiration to extract energy from carbohydrates they create, and they consume oxygen as well. Um, but importantly, as these organisms begin to die off, the organisms that decompose the photoautotrophs also consume the oxygen. Consequently, the overgrowth of algae depletes the levels of oxygen in the water and creates dead zones where fish and other organisms are unable to survive, leading to ecosystem collapse. You've seen the figure on the right before, where a red dot is placed over dead zones along coastal regions around the world. Furthermore, many of these species of algae actually release toxins that directly kill marine organisms. In one example, in 1998, a massive eutrophication event that occurred in the waters around Hong Kong devastated 22 of the island's 26 fish farms, killed 2,500 tons of fish, and led to the equivalent of $32 million in economic losses. The next item to address is synthetic pesticide use. This one we have touched on as well. As pesticide use has increased, the rates of resistance to those chemicals among pests has increased in tandem. On the left, you will see increase in insects resistant to Bt, and on the right, you will see the increase in weeds resistant to Roundup. Today, there are over 400 insects and mite pests that have developed resistance to insecticides, and over 70 fungi that have developed resistance to fungicides. The ubiquitous use of insecticides has also had a negative consequence on beneficial insects such as pollinators, insects that we don't want to kill and upon whom we have actually become dependent for crops to survive and reproduce. And finally, although the two pesticides that we talked about, Roundup and BT, are pretty safe, they are certainly not the only pesticides, and many pesticides are harmful to human health. Prolonged exposure to them can cause cancer and lung disease, neurological dysfunction, and skin and eye diseases. The primary effect of these exposures is taking place in developing countries, where the regulatory systems for protecting human and environmental health are less robust. Next, we have irrigation. Irrigation is the provision of groundwater supply to croplands so that they don't have to rely on rainfall exclusively. Whereas rainfall can be inconsistent from year to year, groundwater supplies are more stable, or at least they have been. But now groundwater supplies are being threatened as well. Uh, as irrigation practices expand, agriculture began to move into areas that completely lacked the rainfall needed to support those crops, relying fully on irrigation to do the job. Arizona is the leading example. Uh, Agriculture being established in a region that lacks the natural resources to support it. What you see here is a chart published by the U.S. Department of Agriculture showing the rates of irrigation usage per acre of cropland by state. While the state of California has the largest number of acres of irrigated cropland and therefore uses the largest volume of irrigation water. If you look, the average amount of water, pardon me, that farmers have to use on each acre of cropland, Arizona is by far the highest. We have to use more than 50% more groundwater per acre to raise crops here compared to the next closest state on the list, California. In Arizona, the average amount of water applied per acre of crops is 4.7 acre feet, which where an acre foot is the volume of water required to cover 1 acre to a depth of 1 foot in water. It's the equivalent of 325,851 gallons. And that's because we just don't have the rainfall, so more water has to be artificially provided from rivers, namely the Colorado and underground aquifers. And this puts strain on those water resources for other sectors like residential water use, commercial and industrial, and of course the needs of the ecosystems because it's not just humans who need this scarce resource. Increased rates of irrigation have also led to problems with salinization of cropland. Remember, salinity is the concentration of salt in the soil. River water and other sources of groundwater has a much higher concentration of salt compared to rainfall. And so by applying river water to cropland through intensive irrigation, you introduce a high amount of salts that accumulate over time and harm the quality of the soil and the productivity of the plant growth. One interesting fact about salinization in our region is that it has been going on for a long time and probably affected pre colonial civilizations as well. You may know that this region was historically occupied by the indigenous community known as the Hohokam, who thrived in the Sonoran Desert from approximately the year 300 to about mid 15th century, when their communities were abandoned rather suddenly. There's been much archaeological and anthropological investigation into the cause of this abandonment, and some scholars argue that salinization of cropland was partly responsible, given that these communities had constructed highly sophisticated irrigation systems that drew from the Salt and Gia rivers for raising their crops. So, one school of thought is that the abandonment of settlements was driven by the failure of agriculture, which itself was caused in part by salinization of the soil by river water. We don't know this for certain, but it's certainly a potential warning for us residents of the Sonoran Desert as we continue to intensively irrigate our cropland with river water today. The final factor that we need to discuss: machinery and automation. In other words, the development of machines that took over the brunt of the labor associated with farming, including planting, spraying, harvesting, tilling, threshing, processing, etc. While this was certainly more efficient, the reliance on this sophisticated and expensive machines led to the consolidation of agriculture into the hands of a small number of large commercial farming operations and the displacement of small farmers. You can see this reflected in the number of farms versus the size of farms over time in the US. As you see in blue, the number of farms has dropped off dramatically over the past 70 years. And as you can see in green, the average size of a farm has gone up. The number of farms continues to decline, with 20 million more farms dropping off the map or being absorbed by the large farms between 2007 and 2022. So the farming industry has become consolidated, with a small number of operations accounting for most of the production. And this has eroded the livelihood of the rural communities that have historically made their living through farming, but can't compete with large operations that can afford to upgrade to expensive, sophisticated machinery.